Women didn't have ADHD, women didn't have dyslexia, women didn't have anything. Women were just ignored. Why did we overlook all those girls in school?
What is like the effect of that on the developing mind?
Heartbreaking. To be told all your life that, it's in your imagination, there's nothing wrong with you, or you're depressed, you've got something wrong with your brain chemistry, and here's medication that's going to put it right, which actually it doesn't. Being given a prescription doesn't make your ADHD go away, and it certainly doesn't teach you how to live successfully with it.
Dr. Tony Lloyd is a psychologist,
academic, and ADHD specialist with over 20 years experience.
As the CEO of the ADHD Foundation,
the largest neurodiversity charity in Europe.
He's an expert in all things ADHD.
Not everybody wants a diagnosis, not everybody needs a diagnosis, certainly not everybody wants medication, but there's only 250,000 children and adults combined who access medication as a way of managing ADHD for themselves in the UK, out of 3 million. So it's not overdiagnosed. There's 8.5 million people taking antidepressants. Cultural stigma and shaming still exists. Let's move past this idea that you've got to think like me in order to have a place in society.
Loyal listeners and viewers, I can't thank you enough for tuning in. If you've ever felt broken or different, I hope this helps in your search for answers and community. And do you know what would really help me in return? By clicking the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. It might not seem like much, but at ADHD Chatter, it means a huge deal. And with this, I can book more incredible guests and keep the self-discovery fire alive for all of us, myself included. Just one click of a button goes really far. And remember, you have always been enough. What is your mission in regards to ADHD?
It evolved, to be honest, Alex. I think it was that thing about I wanted people to better understand it. There was so much myth and stigma and misunderstanding and ignorance and shame about it. And the more I heard, there was these recurring themes all the time, and I just thought there was so much injustice about it and unfairness about it. And because I trained as a child and adolescent psychotherapist as well, and a lot of the children that were referred to me, I would get this report about this child is defiant, this child is naughty, all these kind of shaming sort of words. And my experience of those young people was completely different. And I was kind of thinking, why are you perceived this way? And then I did a piece of doctoral research, which meant me being in an educational setting for a number of years and seen it firsthand, really. And it's interesting how a lot of the young people I met then, which was sort of 30 years ago, 25 years ago, who in adulthood have come for a diagnosis, because it was pretty clear to me at the time, but I think for particularly a lot of the sixth formers, it was a label they absolutely did not want, and it was a label that their parents didn't want, and it was a label that meant, you were consigned to the classroom or the porter cabin. You didn't belong here. And there was a lot of those kind of, old cliches. Well, if you're not learning in my classroom, it's because you're not intelligent, or you're lazy, or there's something medically wrong with you. But any of those things abdicates my responsibility for helping you to learn. And that's not a criticism of the teaching profession. It's not a job I could do. But I married a teacher as well. So when Colin and I first met, and he said, well, not long after we first met, and I told him I had ADHD, he went, "Don't be ridiculous, you can't possibly have ADHD." I said, "Oh, really?" And then bizarrely we ended up working together. But yeah, it started as realizing at 29 I had ADHD from my younger cousin when I was in Canada, spending time with family there, and that really stirred my interest. And then I think the more I heard and learned from other people about how awful their experience had been, the discrimination and the stigma and the shame and the misunderstanding, it just kind of made me more and more passionate. I think, I've got to do something about this. It was never intended to be a life mission or anything. That kind of evolved.
Why do you think Colin said you can't possibly have ADHD?
Because I've got lots of degrees. So therefore, if I'm clever, then therefore I can't have ADHD. Because, of course, that was the myth, wasn't it? This was about naughty, fidgety boys who were lazy or morally undeserving because they couldn't do as they were told. But, I have memories of being hit with the bat every week in assembly at primary school because I couldn't stop fidgeting. And of course, now we know that one of the ways the body naturally produces more dopamine is to move. So it's interesting. I've always thought it was interesting that for adults in the workplace, being hyperactive is a real asset and seen as a strength. You've got loads of energy and, whereas in a classroom, it's a disorder.
I think so many people listening have probably got like their own Colin in their life. Someone who said to them, you can't possibly have ADHD because it's only boys, or you can't have ADHD because you're not physically hyperactive, or you just need to try harder. And the sort of shame maybe and the fear that people anticipate when they want to open up, but they don't because they feel like there is mistruths and myths surrounding ADHD.
I think thankfully that's changing. I think people aren't ashamed anymore. Parents aren't ashamed of the fact that their children are neurodiverse or neurodivergent, depending on whichever term you prefer to use. I'm not a fan of dichotomies that create othering, neurotypical versus neurodivergent or whatever it might be. But I think it's an integral part of the human condition to want to be known and understood and loved and feel that you belong. It's also, I think, how human beings come to know themselves through their interaction with other people. We're a social species. The genetic imperative is relationship driven, isn't it? And I remember having that conversation with Colin and saying, well, just because I've got lots of degrees, why would I not be ADHD? And he just said, well, that's not what I remember, of all the children that I've worked with. And I said, well, interestingly, the only people I really remember in my life are those that were kind, that didn't really care whether they were ADHD or autistic or gay or straight or black or Chinese or an immigrant or whatever it might be. Having letters after your name in the greater scheme of things is I think, the least of your worth as a human being. So I do think it's important in an age of identity that we know who we are and we know who we are in relation to other people.
I think it's a really important point to sort of expand on a bit. I think there is a lot of stereotyping and myths and untruths around ADHD. And I think because we are very intuitive, we really pick up on that injustice and we pick up on the fact that people are ignorant sometimes. And on the furthest end of that spectrum is someone might open up to the family member or a colleague or a friend and they're met with, well, ADHD doesn't exist. That's the extreme end of that response.
Or it's trendy. It's a trendy thing to have now, apparently.
Everyone must have ADHD these days. Well, exactly. I mean, what would you say to someone who is met with, if someone said to you ADHD isn't real, how would you respond to that?
I would say that, well, to begin with, that's my lived experience and that's how I make sense of it. Although I don't like the acronym. I think the acronym attention deficit hyperactivity disorder does not represent what that particular neurotype is. I always knew that things would never change in schools or in the NHS unless it was by popular demand. So I realized quite quickly that in the same way that, the work that you do, it was about how do you win hearts and minds. So things like the Umbrella Project and things like that were all about really trying to, as Ellie Chappell says, flip that narrative away from this deficit-based notion of, there's something wrong with you, to a more balanced and strength-based kind of perspective. Because I think there are lots of successful people, aren't there, with ADHD. 29% of entrepreneurs apparently have got ADHD. That doesn't come as a surprise to me. I've met lots of people who, by earthly standards, are very successful, who have ADHD or dyslexia, autism, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. And I always kind of saw it, well, this is just a natural expression of the wonderful diversity of human neurocognitive ability. And usually when people say, oh, it doesn't exist, or it's a cultural construct, or more recently over the past couple of years in certain newspapers, that it's, it's a trend that people are using to try and get benefits, apparently, which is certainly not my experience. And I think this is the weird thing about our culture, Alex. In school, if you're dyslexic, ADHD, or no matter how high your IQ, you're classed as less intelligent. If you don't learn and pass exams the way we do things in our educational system, then there's something wrong with you, and it's called a learning disability. In the medical model, it's called a neurodevelopmental disorder. Then I think we can't tell young people throughout their lives, you think you're stupid, you don't belong in this classroom, there's something medically wrong with you, or you're lazy, or your parents are not very good parents. And we do that to them all the way through at a very vulnerable age when they're establishing their identity and their self-concept, and then say to them at 16, you're not disabled. That doesn't compute at all. And really, I think that's come about because we disable people, because they're different. And I think I've said this before in the UK, if you were a child of colour in our education system, you were still classed as educationally subnormal right up until the early 70s by virtue of your race, which is abhorrent. If you were gay, you were classed as mentally ill right up until 1994, which is abhorrent. And what is it about our culture that's often wanted to exclude people simply for being different? And again, it comes back to what we were talking about before, about that imperative as a social species to belong to a social group, whether it's the family group or the classroom or the sports team or whatever it might be. People want to feel valued and belong and contribute to the communities that they're part of. And we are genetically programmed to experience anxiety and distress when we feel isolated and alone. And I've just always kind of tried to figure out, well, what is it about people that wants to exclude people for being different? And then you hear, all the research that's come out over the past sort of decade or more, like over 50% of the legal profession are autistic, over 50% of engineering professionals are autistic, 40% of millionaires are dyslexic, et cetera, et cetera. And you just think, well, would Einstein have been in the special needs class in school these days? Would he be one of the children that was excluded? Because 7 out of every 10 kids who are excluded from our schools are still these different thinkers. And now it's well established that it's got nothing to do with low IQ. And maybe we shouldn't attach labels to people for simply being different. But at the same time, having some kind of label that doesn't carry shame and stigma or have disorder word tacked on the end is important in understanding who am I and how do I relate to the world. It's an important part of developing your self-concept. So for anybody who says it doesn't exist, I would just say, well, you're ignorant, you don't know. We know that there are gene variants involved, so we know that there are significant genetic factors. We know there's a strong heritability factor. You're 5 times more likely to have ADHD if you've got a family member who's got it. It does exist, but I don't ascribe to the idea of it being a disorder.
If you could rename it, I think Ned Hallowell, he suggested...
I love Ned, vast.
Vast, varied attention, stimuli, trait.
Yeah.
And vast potential. He would like to see it renamed.
Yeah, no, I've got a lot of time for Ned. And like Ned, I've been accused of having a slightly Pollyanna notion of ADHD, but I don't think that's true. I don't think... I've got first-hand experience of ADHD. I know how difficult it can be to live with. I had a breakdown at 15, and that was a lot to do with having ADHD. But I think what's really interesting, and the last conversation I had with Ned, which was all about the whole neurodiversity movement and how it's changing public perspectives, and it's really beginning to move around the world in a very powerful way. It's obviously... in the UK, things are much more advanced. And Ed said that neurodiversity is a triumph of lived experience over theory. Because your question about, well, does it exist or not? Well, there are plenty of academics and researchers, who in ivory towers, and again, I say that respectfully, we're very selective about what we measure. And if I want to sit and find fault with somebody, then I'll do that. But sometimes it's about the imperative. And I think the imperative has often been, this child won't be what I want them to be. So what do I have to do? Remove them so I'm not responsible for them. Or medicate them to make them behave. And I'm a supporter of medication. I'm a supporter of whatever works for people. It's not for everybody. But I know the difference it's made in a lot of people's lives. I think the only problem with it is that some people think that it's a neurological El Dorado when it's just a cognitive enhancer. Being given a prescription doesn't make your ADHD go away. And it certainly doesn't teach you how to live successfully with it. But I think historically, there's always been that thing about, well, here you go, there's something wrong with you. There's a tablet. And I think that has added to this myth that ADHD medication was some kind of morality pill for naughty children, which of course it isn't. So for the naysayers, I think the argument's been won. You can't just dismiss people as either they don't exist or their particular way of experiencing the world doesn't exist, because our brains are only half formed when we're born. We're an incredibly adaptive species. The environment, the context we're in really matters. And ADHD can be a real asset in some contexts. In a classroom, it's much more of a disadvantage, but it needn't be.
Quick brain teaser for you all. A question only those with an IQ above 200 can answer. We're 7 minutes in. So, what time is it? Yes, that's right. It's Tiimo app time. The award-winning Tiimo app is the perfect life-hacking tool to help your time management and kick you up the bum when you need it most. If you want to stay ahead of the competition, then the visual planning Tiimo app is specifically designed to help your structuring, organizing, focusing, and goal setting. For those who struggle to initiate tasks or find big tasks too overwhelming to even start, Tiimo AI Planning Assistant transforms a single prompt into a structured plan to get the ball rolling. It has a visual timer providing a tangible, visual, and colourful representation of time to help users pace themselves so you never miss a deadline ever again. It also offers lock and home screen widgets to keep your tasks in view for those of you who are very out of sight, out of mind with your chores and afraid you might forget them. It brilliantly centers all your tasks in one place to streamline your overflowing schedules and make them much more digestible and a lot less intimidating. Why choose a chaotic life when you can easily download Tiimo app to help get things done? Back to the episode.
The people who are experiencing those advantages, like people with ADHD who the doctors, the lawyers, or not necessarily stereotypical successful jobs, but the people who are content and happy and not anxious every day. What's the difference between those two people? Was it one group was exposed to more criticisms when they were younger? They have more self-esteem issues. They don't have the self-belief.
It's a really, really important question to ask. And the only way I can answer it is this. There are many times in my life where my ADHD has been an asset. But there are other times in my life where it has been incredibly difficult. And context matters. If you have a very traumatic childhood and you've got ADHD, you're incredibly vulnerable to developing, persistent anxiety, depression, things like that. But I also think that we can change the context. We're an adaptive species. And we can change the context so it's not a disability. I don't like the idea. I don't identify as disabled. But I could say there's been a couple of times in my life where I was disabled because the context I was in and the fact that I had ADHD made it so. School, university being one of them. But I can think of another time, over 10 years ago, where I had a year where everything that could have gone wrong, dad died, stepdad died, mother-in-law, it was like everything went wrong. And I think sometimes you can be perhaps more easily overwhelmed when, that cumulative kind of life events that everybody goes through sometimes it can knock your resilience. But I mean, I've always been fortunate in that, I'm very happily married, got good friends. And also because I learned at 29 years of age, the kind of lifestyle choices and strategies that I needed to maintain if I was ever going to be able to manage ADHD successfully.
And when did the focus really land on ADHD? What sort of was the driver for that passion?
It seemed to me with the clients that I was working with as a therapist, the kind of principal process with therapy is, well, we help the individual bring into awareness what's not working for them and trust in the individual's ability then to find the resource within themselves to make the changes that they need to. But what I found with some of the clients I had who had ADHD, what the issue was for them in terms of change was how did they develop the strategies and the resilience and also their physical well-being and lifestyle choices to enable them to actually bring about the changes that they wanted to bring in their lives in a successful way. It seemed to me that they knew what needed to change and they even knew how, but somehow they couldn't quite make it happen. And I realized that things like having a healthy diet and exercise and all these kind of things were really important. And when I looked on the NHS website, the landing page for ADHD, which didn't change, by the way, until 3 years ago, the landing page said, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, people with ADHD are more likely to commit crime and become alcoholics and misuse drugs. And you just thought, well, that's enough to put you off, isn't it? That's like not what a lot of people identify with. You weren't a naughty, fidgety boy at school and you're not an alcoholic drug user who's committing crimes. And again, you just think the more and more, no wonder people are confused. And a lot of the controversy about TikTok, for example, where some journalists are saying, all these people are getting a diagnosis and they don't really need it and we're overdiagnosing, which is not true. There are 3 million people with ADHD in the UK. The World Health Organization says 5.9% who have ADHD. Not everybody wants a diagnosis. Not everybody needs a diagnosis. Certainly not everybody wants medication. But there's only 250,000 children and adults combined who access medication as a way of managing ADHD for themselves in the UK, out of 3 million. So it's not overdiagnosed. There's 8.5 million people taking antidepressants. So depression certainly is overdiagnosed and overmedicated, but that never gets talked about. So that cultural stigma and shaming still exists. And I think for a lot of people, how can you take responsibility for your health, your family life, your economic independence, employment, etc., if you don't know what it is that might be impairing you from leading a happy, healthy, and successful life? And I think the vacuum that existed around decent quality public health information was filled by social media, which democratized knowledge that had been the exclusive reserve of clinicians and researchers. So I think it's important for people to be able to know who they are without shame and understand that we all have vulnerabilities as well as strengths. And it's how do you play to your strengths and how do you manage your vulnerabilities?
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. We've seen a huge increase in people getting assessed and diagnosed, particularly in the last decade. Yeah. And I imagine social media is in part responsible.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at the ADHD Foundation, we had nearly 500,000 social media followers. I think there was 1 year during the pandemic where we got 4 billion media impressions. So not everything that's out there on the internet is nonsense. I do get concerned about some of the things that, so-called influencers post on social media, which may not be accurate. But then my response to that, to the Department of Health and NHS England was, well, for God's sake, put some decent quality information and make that available through public health services. You know, we don't want to create dependencies. We don't want to pathologize people. We need to get rid of the disorder word, but give people the information, and let's move past this idea that, you know, you've got to think like me in order to have a place in society, because we've been there before. We've done it with race. We've done it with LGBTQ community. We've done it with other minority groups. This idea that, you know, you all have to be the same. You all have to think the same. And we all know that there are plenty of failed businesses where the boardroom was full of people who all indulged in groupthink and affirmed each other by all agreeing on the same thing, only to go bust. There has to be, I think, different perspectives, because if you look at the metadata, at least 1 in 5 people have one of the 5 naturally occurring common neurodevelopmental neurotypes: ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. That's a lot of people. That's 20% of the population of this planet. There's got to be an evolutionary reason why 20% of us think differently from the norm. And who decided what this arbitrary line was around? Well, that's a diagnosis, not ADHD, or that's a diagnosis. If you've reached that point, you've got ADHD. And it comes back to the point before. ADHD can be a real asset or a disadvantage, but it depends on the context. In the same way that if you had dyscalculia, you wouldn't become an accountant. You know, I could never be a successful Olympic athlete because I don't have the physique for it. But I think it's people have a right to have balanced, accurate information. But I think we've got to accept the fact that science, as we call it, and the medical manuals, which have godlike status, are very influenced by cultural mores. So women is another example, isn't it? Women didn't have ADHD. Women didn't have dyslexia. Women didn't have anything. Women were just ignored. Why? Why did we overlook all those girls in school?
Why do you think we did? I mean, 85% of people who listen to this podcast are women.
Yeah.
We know the biggest undiagnosed group are women now. A whole generation of women are coming through, you know, getting answers finally after being let down, misdiagnosed with an anxiety disorder, told sometimes that they were crazy by their doctor.
Or just being emotional.
Too much.
Terribly un-British thing, isn't it, to be emotional?
But why do you think, like, women were left behind so much?
And gender discrimination, unquestionably. And at school, well, they're gonna get married and have babies. It's not going to matter.
What do you think the effect is? Like, if you are told that you're crazy or too much or too sensitive for years and years and years, decades sometimes, what is like the effect of that on the developing mind?
Heartbreaking. To be told all your life that, you know, it's in your imagination, there's nothing wrong with you, or you're depressed, you've got something wrong with your brain chemistry, and here's medication that's going to put it right, which actually it doesn't. I mean, the effect size of antidepressants is about 0.3 out of a maximum of 1. The effect size for ADHD medication is 0.9. It does what it says on the tin, but what it does is just improve the regulation of dopamine and noradrenaline in your brain, which has significant advantages in terms of your cognitive functioning. And too often I think we look at symptoms, don't we? And we're looking for cause, or we look at correlations. You know, people who are very, very stressed can look like they've got ADHD, but it's not ADHD. It's stress. And I think for women, obviously there's been that historical gender bias. We always diagnose 4 boys to every girl. I think it's come down a bit now. It's about 3 boys to every girl in schools, in school age and young people. But in adulthood, the ratio is the same. We diagnose the same number of women as we do men, in the strict sense of sort of how we extrapolate the data from NHS. Half of all new adult diagnoses are women.
Well, it can be stressful going years and years and being told that your suspicions are false. And I hear like women get diagnosed and they have relief and grief, but also anger and resentment. And quite rightly, in a lot of cases, they're really pissed off that they were let down for so long. Do you think that anger and that emotional response is justified in women?
Yes, I do. Because you would look back, I did, and think, how different might my life have been had I known how to approach study and exams for somebody who was academically gifted but was always getting disciplined for not getting the kind of grades that I was capable of, apparently. The people who have been treated with antidepressants for years and years and years when the underlying cause of the depression was really ADHD and dopaminergic and noradrenergic dysregulation, or just a different neurotype that is. If you know that there are some things that you're going to find difficult, then you develop strategies to manage it. If we want people to take responsibility for their health and well-being and their economic independence, how are we going to be able to do that unless we help them understand themselves and not pathologize them simply because they're different?
Tony, I've heard you mention in the past something called a purgatory period in response to a phase you might go through when you are misdiagnosed or pre-diagnosis. What is a purgatory period?
I think it's different things for different people, Alex. I think there is that moment of epiphany where you think, oh, I wonder if I've got ADHD. Is that what it is? And then you find it incredibly difficult to speak to anybody who's got any knowledge of it, because most GPs don't. I mean, they know a bit more now. Most general psychiatrists didn't know anything about ADHD in the UK until a few years ago because it wasn't even on the psychiatry curriculum. Can you believe that? And I think the frustration and the sense of isolation that comes with, well, why didn't anybody tell me? Or why didn't anybody have that information available so that I could have learned for myself? Or why wasn't the information that was available balanced and constructive rather than, oh, well, you're more likely to be a criminal or an alcoholic, or you're a delinquent child or whatever, because you know that there are some things that you probably would have done differently and perhaps could have done better, and maybe some trapdoors that you could have avoided had you known. And addiction is a particular one for many people. And for me, it was caffeine. 20 cups of tea a day with sugar in them. Started smoking when I was sort of 14. I didn't know that those things were psychostimulants. I didn't realize that because I used to cycle for miles. And then I did the whole gym thing for years. Didn't realize that actually what I was doing was trying to generate more dopamine so that I felt healthy and sort of well-regulated and in control of my own life. And for people who've developed addictions to alcohol, which is not something I ever touch, it does nothing for me at all, just makes me fall asleep. But for people who've developed addictions to drugs, I just think, therefore, for the grace of God, I think it's instinctive in all of us, isn't it? We would want, if we were in a state of constant anxiety or extreme distress, you want some relief from that. And the people around you, no matter how much they love you, don't always necessarily know what to do in order to help you in that distress state. And people develop all kinds of addictions. Some of them can be quite healthy, but some of them not so much. And I think, we've seen this. I've worked with a lot of people who are in sort of television and the music industry, who've developed addictions and then found out they had ADHD. And if I'd have known, I would never have touched that, and I've heard it joked a few times about, all my friends used to get high when they did a line of coke at university. It just used to make me calm. That's why.
That might be one of the telltale signs.
Yeah.
Do you think, what's the difference then? Someone who experiences some of these telltale signs, but they feel like they've got it under control. They suspect that they might have ADHD, but it's not at crisis point.
Mm-hmm.
What's the tipping point between someone who's in that camp compared to someone who is in crisis point? They really are desperate. They need help, and they desperately do need to go get assessment. Is there like a tipping point that might tip someone from the first camp into that second one?
I think that's down to the individual themselves. I think quite often the individual think, well, I'm in crisis because I'm drinking too much, and therefore it's a moral weakness and it's my own fault. But I've been told all my life I was no good and I'd never come to anything and never did anything at school, so I never got any qualification. I think we can develop a self-concept whereby it can become very self-defeating, and that we have no self-belief or no self-efficacy or confidence that we can have a decent quality life and be happy and healthy, because we've been conditioned into believing that we're not, that there's something wrong with us, or even worse, that we're not deserving happiness, or certainly not deserving of public services, for example.
Can the conversation of masking come in here? And I mean, if you're undiagnosed and as a consequence of not understanding that you might be ADHD, the mask becomes so thick through years and years and years of it getting thicker, you shape-shifting your personality, kind of adjusting who you are in order to fit in time and time again. And because of that mask is so thick, you do put yourself in positions that aren't a good fit for you. So you take on a new job that might be not a good fit, or you get into a new relationship that might not be a new fit. And that cycle of starting things and abandoning them because they're not a good fit ends up taking such a toll on your mental health. You genuinely look back and see this evidence of abandoned relationships, abandoned projects, and that actually makes you feel so terrible. And it's that tips you over into thinking, what the hell is going on? There must be something wrong with me. And that takes you into assessment.
Because you're making the same mistakes over and over again, aren't you? But I come back to this idea about we understand who we are as human beings in relation to other people. And we thrive in relationships and social groups. So for me, I would say that having really good friends and being really happily married to Colin has been one of the most significant factors for me in terms of being well and being happy. But I think the tipping point is unique to the individual. And I think it's about somebody saying to you, have you thought maybe it's this? And if you're in distress and you're struggling and you go into the so-called experts, whether it's the teacher at the school about your child, who it turns out knows nothing about ADHD because they're trained to teach a curriculum and assess you for achieving in that curriculum. They're not taught a great deal about children or developmental psychology or child and adolescent mental health. The element of teacher training for that is just a couple of days, which I think is a great disservice to new teachers. And it's no wonder half of them leave within 5 years, because you're not being trained to work with children. And first and foremost, you're a childcare professional. And what do we find, what is education for? I've always believed that the focus on education, for example, it's all about intellectual development. But the frontal lobe of our brain, where we have executive functioning skills, that part only appeared about 40, 50,000 years ago. And there was no way it could develop without the limbic system and everything else coming first. And I think if we don't address the more fundamental needs of human beings, which is to feel safe, to feel loved, protected, to belong, and have the opportunity to thrive in a social group and learn. I've met plenty of people with PhDs who couldn't boil an egg, and I wouldn't entrust with the care of a rodent. So it's not, intellectual intelligence is only one type of intelligence and ability. And I think for a lot of people, that tipping point is, well, what defines me as being successful or not? Because people who are very wealthy and have very good jobs can still have nervous breakdowns and failed relationships. And so what's the remedy for that?
Could the tipping point be, going back to, you said, a basic human need? I think most people appreciate stability and consistency. And when you can go through a period of your life that knocks you off that course, i.e. a woman going through the menopause, or a couple having a child, or even something like you getting fired, or you go through a grieving process, something so significant that the scaffolding that you have maybe consciously or subconsciously around you starts to wobble. And in some cases it falls down. And it's that event that knocks you off your stable path. That can be the tipping point that causes you to go into full crisis mode.
Yeah, or cumulative disadvantage, cumulative traumatic events. But none of us are immune from life events, aren't we? We all experience bereavement. People can be made redundant through no fault of their own. There are just things that happen in life that affect us. And the degree of resilience that we have is often determined by both a combination of the support structures that we have in place, but also what we know and understand about ourselves and our ability to care for ourselves. And I think self-care is not something that we teach young people or adults enough about. I'd like to come back to that question, though, about masking. We naturally try and assimilate, don't we, in order to belong. There are different social mores in different social groups. The kind of things that you might say at home are not necessarily the things that you would say in work, for example. Or the kind of humour that you might tailor to suit the company. We do what we need to do to fit in. We adhere to the social mores of that particular group, those relationships. I think with masking, it's when you are having to pretend to be something that you're not so much that it's completely exhausting and overwhelming. And the difference between trying to assimilate and having to mask. Having said that, as somebody with ADHD who is at times inclined to candor, doesn't give me the right to offend other people. Say, well, you've just got to put up with that. Or I'm always late for work. Well, that's just my ADHD. Well, my response to that is get an earlier train. Or, okay, well, if you really do struggle with time blindness, then we have an arrangement whereby if you arrive 20 minutes late, you finish 20 minutes late. There's a reasonable balance with that. And I had an instance recently of somebody who was kind of insulting a colleague, and they used the argument, well, it's me ADHD, it's me impulsivity. And I was like, well, given that the comments were racist, actually, no, that's absolutely not acceptable.
Wow.
Impulsivity or not, ADHD is not an excuse. It's an explanation. But I also think if you give somebody the knowledge, the skills, the support, then we help people learn to become accountable for themselves.
Do you think masking sometimes, or I totally agree. I think firstly it's not an excuse, it is an explanation, and there is a difference between putting on a version of yourself in order to want to put your best foot forward as almost like an evolutionary survival instinct. And then there's the other side of it, which is really intentionally adjusting who you are to such an extent that it's not good for your own well-being.
No, it's exhausting, yeah.
And I wonder, where does RSD tie into that? Because many of us in the community, we are, because of experiences of being told that we're different and having been exposed to so many more corrective messages, we're almost quite fearful as an adult to offend or to say no, or to stand up for ourselves. And as a consequence of that, we shapeshift and we adjust in order to please the person that we're with, so we don't offend them, so we don't open ourselves up to a criticism.
Yeah.
From your experience, where does the conversation of RSD come into the neurodiverse community?
There are many people who who say that they are particularly sensitive. I don't think that's a weakness, to be quite honest. I think, again, it's a bit of a throwback to our sort of British stiff upper lip kind of idea, isn't it? That, you don't. I don't think there's anything wrong with being sensitive, but I do understand that for many people, their quality of life and sometimes their relationships are impacted by the fact that sometimes they'll take offence when none necessarily is intended. But then I think the responsibility for how we're understood also rests with the communicator, doesn't it? I mean, one of the things you said to me was, what do you want to get from this podcast? And I said, the only thing I can hope to get is that I've been able to answer your questions in a way that other people could make sense of and understand. Being understood is absolutely integral again, isn't it, to how we function as a social species.
With RSD, just going back, do you think it's possible for somebody to be so fearful and trying to avoid a confrontation that they'll put things in place that are detrimental to their own well-being, i.e., like they'll people please, they won't know how to put boundaries in place, they'll put everyone else's needs ahead of their own because they don't want to offend anyone or annoy anyone, and that puts someone else's...
Or the frustration will build up, and then they'll lose it and lose their temper, and I mean, there's a great adage, isn't there, about learn to apply the brakes rather than crash through the roadblocks. But I do think there is some substance, even though RSD is not included in the diagnostic criteria. It's something that a lot of clinicians will kind of think about and ask people about when they're doing an assessment. There does seem to be this acute sensitivity that comes with ADHD. And whether that's just, as you say, because of having a brain that processes the world we live in a different way to the majority, then, whether that's the reason or whether it is just something about a particular neurology that makes that possible. But then I also think, I look at the number of musicians and artists that I know who have ADHD and the extraordinary sensitivity in their work is a real asset. So again, it's that, hyperactivity can be a real asset. Obviously not in a classroom because it's an inconvenience to everybody else. Being impulsive, being quick-witted, being really good at multitasking. Being impulsive is great if you're a professional athlete on a tennis court where you need these lightning fast responses to be successful at that. Being inattentive, mind wandering, as it's called. I mean, it was Einstein who said that imagination is far greater than knowledge. It's the daydreaming and the mind wandering that is the fertile ground for inventiveness and innovation and creativity. And I think with rejection sensitivity dysphoria, sensitivity can be a real strength and an asset in some contexts, but not necessarily in others, and not necessarily if you're surrounded by people who are not particularly nice.
Do you have any of your own theories, Tony, about ADHD and what it is that aren't commonly spoken about or haven't been published?
No, I think my views on it are fairly well known. I don't believe it's a disorder. I think it's a natural expression, this amazing diversity of human neurocognitive capability and potential. I think there's an evolutionary reason why 1 in 20 of us have an ADHD neurotype. I think it is the universal design that everybody's got a brain as unique as their fingerprint. My hypothesis as to why is that we've all got something to learn from one another. There isn't another human being on this planet that looks like Alex or sounds like Alex. And there's an intelligence behind that, I think, maybe we don't understand or appreciate. And I think there's been an instinct in human beings to control. And yes, we need to have rules and boundaries and regulations. But I think historically, there's been something about us that says, well, if you're not like us, you don't belong here. You're not welcome. You're a threat. There's something wrong with you just because you're different. So no, I think for me, it's very much aligned with the thinking of the whole neurodiversity movement, which is, it is just a natural expression of this diversity of mind that is integral to humankind.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think many people are quite fearful of difference, and they can vent that fear, project it onto the person who might be a child with ADHD. You pick up on that, and that can create a feeling of inadequacy or even shame. But once you push through that and you realize that that person is just venting through fear, and there is brilliance in difference, then you can shelf that shame and you can really begin to unlock the many positives that come with being neurodivergent. Just before we finish, I want to reveal your ADHD item, which has been patiently waiting underneath that cloth this whole time. I ask all my guests to bring in an item that most represents ADHD for them.
Yeah.
I'm going to reveal yours now.
The umbrella.
That's an umbrella.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass the umbrella to you, Tony. And why does an umbrella represent ADHD?
Because working with a group of young people, God, now nearly 10 years ago, and they were looking for a name to call themselves. And they said to me, we're going to call ourselves the Alphabet Kids. And I said, why? He said, because we've got loads of letters after our name like you. And I said, such as? And they went, oh, ADHD, LD, ASD. And I said, look, forget the Ds, but those acronyms, they are really, they all fall under this umbrella of something that we call neurodevelopmental conditions or neurodiversity. And so they call themselves the Umbrella Gang. And then they produced educational comics for the children called the Umbrella Gang. And they were involved in bringing something called the Umbrella Project to life, which was public displays of umbrellas in city centres and in schools and offices. And all these different colours represent what they said were the different colours of their minds. And so, yeah, the umbrella has always been kind of quite a powerful symbol, and actually being adopted by a lot of other organisations now as a symbol of neurodiversity. So for me, that's quite a good thing. From a remarkable group of young people who've actually gone on to achieve really quite extraordinary things. But these were all kids who were in the special needs class and excluded from school, and now they're like on scholarships at Stanford University or top 100 world professional golfers and things like that. So you often don't hear about those success stories, and the umbrella is kind of, I often get photographs sent to me with people and they've got the umbrella, and I know that they're sending me a message because they're holding the umbrella. So yeah,
what a brilliant visual as well to symbolise community. It's so important, isn't it, to feel part of a community. So thank you for the explanation. Just penultimately, Tony, I want to do the ADHD agony aunt section.
Oh right, I heard about this,
which is called the washing machine of woes, because my item is a washing machine.
Right.
Okay. I always leave my laundry in the machine. Do you do that?
Yeah.
You're guilty of that too. Oh, good. Again.
Then I learned that it starts to smell, so you have to wash it again. So don't do it as much anymore.
Yeah, although I've got better. I've started using the Tiimo app, which does remind me. It's still not perfect, but getting there.
Go on.
This week, Tony, in the washing machine of woes, someone's written in and asked, I feel drowned at work and that I have to work 3 times as hard to get anything done. But what's worse is my colleagues don't even think ADHD is a real thing. What can I do to help communicate my struggles so I don't get fired?
Oh, that's a big question. First of all, I would say wear your ADHD with pride. There's nothing wrong with you. Sometimes we've helped people in the workplace say, well, why don't you have some kind of event, a small umbrella project, for example, where you have 25 umbrellas in the office and everybody says, well, what's this for? And just get people talking about what is neurodiversity, why it's a good thing that we don't all think the same way, and that why it's a good thing that we should celebrate difference as something that really adds, because all the research evidence proves that the more diverse the workforce, the more profitable it is. And I would maybe say to that individual, I would talk to somebody you really trust and explore maybe some of your own issues around self-worth and how you think of yourself because of your ADHD. I don't ascribe to the idea that ADHD is a gift. That's taking it too far. But I think it can be an asset in some aspects of an individual's life. And we're all different. And I mentioned before, we know ADHD is genetic in origin unless you've had a brain injury caused by epilepsy or trauma. We know that by and large ADHD is genetic, but that's only part of the story. Our brains aren't even anywhere near fully developed when we're born. And who we are and who we become is the product of our life experiences. And for that individual, I would say, try and help your colleagues understand neurodiversity from a positive, strength-based perspective, and maybe point out to them that the world is a better place because of Leonardo da Vinci and Albert Einstein and the guy who founded IKEA, Ingvar, I can't remember his surname, and a whole range of people who, in public life and historically, even in the history curriculum in schools, Walt Disney, Henry Ford, all these people who've done amazing things and contributed to our culture, and people are often shocked then to realize that, well, that challenges the stereotype and the misrepresentation that for all of us, our lives are better.
Absolutely. What a fantastic answer. You could even body double with the colleague that you open up with.
Yeah, that's becoming really
each other out.
Yeah, that's
so fascinating, Tony. Just finally, I want to do the final section, which is I'm going to deliver a letter from the previous guest.
right. Okay.
They wrote 3 rules to live by. They wrote it on an envelope. They posted it in that post office, and I'm going to deliver it. And I'm going to deliver it, Tony, to you. And if you could kindly read the last guest's 3 rules to live by.
Slow down. Take a moment to breathe and be present even in the middle of your busy life. Wow. Well, that really resonates with me because I've just worked sort of stupid hours for years and exhausted myself and ignored where it's kind of impacted on my health. Revisit your self-awareness through journaling, learning, coaching, conversation, and self-reflection. I've done that all my life, actually, but it's one of the best pieces of guidance you could offer anyone. And become aware of your thoughts as well as your struggles, your strengths as well as your struggles, to overcome any ADHD shame. That's
3 powerful rules.
3
there,
really
yeah.
powerful. So whoever that was, thank you very much. I'm sure they'll resonate with everybody who's
I
watching.
laughed when you said the first one because you said slow down. You reminded me of Paolo Nutini when he starts off the song. Slow down.
But it's been, it's a particular. And the other thing, of course, for me, Alex, is that we've got to the age of 63 and my mind is still hyperactive, but my body is just not capable of doing what it used to.
It's been such a privilege, Tay. Like I said at the beginning, I was amazed that we haven't crossed paths before, but very aware of your amazing work.
And thank you very much for asking me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tony.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt with an ad read. I know it can ignite rage, but a brief word from our sponsor. You'll hate slow talkers like I do, so I'll keep this snappy. If you've ever wanted the specialized support of a highly qualified, world-renowned, Harvard-educated ADHD psychiatrist right there with you at all times, now's your chance. The one and only Dr. Ned Hallowell, ADHD specialist and best-selling author, has worked with some of the brightest minds in the ADHD world to develop an app that makes his knowledge on how to manage ADHD and stress accessible to all. Features include customized and tailored daily exercises to stimulate the cerebellum and proven to help manage those trickier aspects of ADHD. 4 sessions of virtual ADHD individual coaching tailored to your needs. A self-EMDR program, a cutting-edge treatment for ADHD to help target that unwanted stress and anxiety with 2 personal coaching sessions. Lastly, if you've not officially been diagnosed yet, the app offers several reliable self-administered diagnostic assessments of ADHD that can help you see if you actually have ADHD. And the app includes daily coaching tips written by Dr. Ned Hallowell for how to best utilize each day on the program. All of this and more is just a thumb swipe away with the Hallowell Brain Health app. The app is available for the tablet or smartphone, 10% off if you use the link in the bio. Back to the episode.